Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're zeroing in on two really essential tools for automation, Bash and Python scripting.
Yeah, we've got some great sources lined up, some practical comparisons, different use cases, even a bit of a debate about, what's best for command line tools.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to distill the key differences, help you understand where each one shines, and, well, when you might want to use one over the other.
Makes sense. Get that intuition for picking the right tool for the job.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Bash first. It's sort of the foundation for so many people in, like, the Unix and Linux world. What's the core idea behind Bash scripting?
Right, so Bash, the born-again shell, it's basically the command line brain for most Unix-like systems. Scripting in Bash is just automating the commands you'd normally type into the terminal.
Okay.
And because it's so tightly integrated with the OS, it's super efficient for things like sysadmin tags, automating deployments, anything you do on the command line.
Like those basic commands, echo, cd, ls, grep.
Exactly. Those are all native Bash things. You just string them together in a script.
Yeah.
That direct access to system utilities, that's really Bash's superpower.
So if someone's just starting out, what are the absolute kind of building blocks they need to know for a Bash script?
Well, the basics are pretty standard programming concepts. Just with Bash's flavor, you've got variables, right? You set them with an equal sign, like x10, no spaces around the equals. That trips people up sometimes.
Ah,
Then conditionals. If, then else, and phi to end it. So you can make decisions like if 6 ducks GT5. Got to remember those square brackets and the $sign for the variable.
right. The syntax can be a bit particular.
It can. And loops, of course. For loops, to go through lists of things, while loops to repeat stuff as long as something's true. Crucial for automation.
Okay.
And finally, functions. You can define reusable blocks of code using the function keyword or just the name followed by parentheses. Helps keep things organized. Those are really the core pieces.
So standard programming ideas, but yeah, tailored for that command line environment. What about like real world stuff beyond just listing files? Where does Bash really shine?
Oh, it's fantastic when you're directly messing with the file system or calling other command line programs.
Okay.
So complex file manipulation, renaming batches of files, searching and replacing text inside files, zipping things up. It's great for that. And we've got links to examples, I think.
Yep. In the note.
Cool. And system administration is huge. Setting up backups with tools like skiP or rsync, scanning log files for errors, automating software updates across like multiple servers, that apt-get update example we saw.
Because it's so close to the system already.
Exactly. It feels really natural for those kinds of OS-level tasks.
Okay, that gives us a really solid picture of Bash.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears to Python now. It's often called a general-purpose language, but it's also huge for scripting.
Yeah.
How does it fit in here?
Yeah, Python's different. It's not just a shell language. People use it for web development, data science, AI, machine learning, all sorts of things.
But for scripting, its big advantages are its readability. The syntax is generally seen as much cleaner, clearer, uses indentation for structure, which some love, some hate, but it is consistent.
Yeah.
And it has this massive ecosystem, a huge standard library, often called batteries included, plus tons of third-party modules you can just pull in.
So you're not starting from scratch as often.
Exactly. You can usually find existing tested code for complex stuff. That's a major draw.
And when people do use Python for scripting, what kinds of things are they typically doing?
A really wide range, actually. It's great for more complex automation, tasks that need maybe more sophisticated logic than Bash handles easily.
Okay.
It's a powerhouse for data processing, especially with large amounts of data. Scientific computing uses it a lot. Web scraping, pulling data off websites is a big one. Interacting with APIs.
Ah, APIs. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and it's particularly good with structured data formats. Things like JSON or XML, which are everywhere now. Python handles those much more naturally than Bash usually does. So, similar question is with Bash.
Huh.
What are the absolute fundamentals if you're writing a Python script? The core building blocks.
Cool. So again, many concepts are similar, just expressed differently. Variables are assigned with like x equals 10. Nice and simple.
Okay.
Conditionals use if, elif, else, followed by a colon, and then indented blocks of code. So if by 5. That indentation is key.
Right, that enforces the structure.
Exactly. Loops are similar too. For loops iterate over lists, dictionaries, whatever, while loops repeat based on a condition. Pretty standard stuff.
And functions.
Defined with the def keyword, so def my function, again, followed by an indented block. The syntax overall is just, Well, many find it more explicit and maybe easier to read, especially compared to Bash's symbols.
You mentioned the modules again. That really sounds like a key differentiator.
Here.
Can you expand on that? What are these modules and how do they boost Python scripting?
Oh, they're huge. Think of them as toolkits you can import into your script. Need to interact with the operating system. Import the OS module. Then you can do things like change directories, os.chdr, make directories, os.mkdr, check if a file exists, os.path.exists.
Okay, so OS interaction, but within Python.
Exactly. Need to work with dates and times. The date time module is your friend. Get the current time, calculate differences, parse date strings.
Yeah.
It's all there.
Super useful.
Totally. Handling CSV files, import the CSV module. Reading, writing, easy, need to copy or move files around. The Sheetal module does that high-level stuff.
Okay.
And for anything network-related, talking to the internet, the requests module is almost the standard. Sending HTTP requests, downloading files, talking to APIs. It makes it incredibly simple.
Wow, yeah. That's a lot of built-in power.
It really is. That modularity lets you tackle really diverse problems without writing everything yourself. It's core to Python's philosophy.
So can you give us some examples of maybe more complex scripts where Python using these modules really, pulls ahead?
Sure. Web scraping is a classic example. You use requests to grab the web page's HTML, right? Then you use another library, often Beautiful Soup, to parse that HTML, to navigate through its structure and pull out exactly the bits you want. Like the BBC News headlines example we looked at, doing that cleanly in Bash would be tricky.
Yeah, I can imagine. Lots of grep instead, maybe.
Probably, and likely quite brittle. Then there's data analysis. Python is dominant here.
Right, with libraries like pandas.
Exactly. Pandas, NumPy for numerical stuff, matplotlib for plotting. You can load data from a CSV, clean it up, run statistical analysis, find correlations, create charts and graphs, all within Python. The example script we have shows loading data, describing it, plotting it. That's far beyond typical Bash territory.
Okay, clear advantages there for certain tasks.
Yeah.
So let's do the head-to-head now. Bash versus Python. First up, syntax and readability. How do they compare?
This is maybe the most obvious difference for many people.
Yeah.
Bash syntax. Well, it can be dense. Lots of special characters, deleo, backticks, quotes. It has its logic, but it can look cryptic if you're not used to it. Makes scripts harder to read and maintain sometimes.
Right, that learning curve we mentioned.
Yeah. Python, on the other hand, really prioritizes readability. The clean syntax, the mandatory indentation. It generally leads to code that's easier to follow, especially for larger scripts or for teams working together.
Makes sense. What about just raw functionality and capabilities?
Python generally wins here just because of its breadth. Being a general-purpose language with that huge library ecosystem means it can do so much more out of the box. Web stuff, data science, complex algorithms.
Things Bash wasn't really designed for?
Exactly. Bash is brilliant for orchestrating system commands and simple file operations. Python can do that too, using modules like O's and subprocess, but it also brings all this other power. Like the UVO source mentioned, Python handles complex data, APIs, large data sets much more elegantly than Bash typically can.
Okay, performance. This one seems debated. What's the deal? Bash faster. Python faster.
It's nuanced. The traditional view was Bash is faster for simple things because it's run directly by the shell, no separate interpreter startup needed. Python needs the Python interpreter to start up and parse the code. So for a tiny script that just runs one command, Bash might start faster. We saw that Hacker News comment comparing it to Node.js startup time.
Right.
Python's libraries, especially for things like data processing or complex calculations, are often highly optimized C extensions. So for computationally heavy tasks, Python can actually end up being much faster overall.
Ah, so startup versus execution speed.
Pretty much. And as that DEV community comment pointed out, the shell is an interpreter too, so it's not like Bash is compiled code. For complex stuff, Python's optimized libraries often give it the edge, despite the initial overhead.
Okay. What about portability, getting scripts to run on different machines?
Bash has a strong advantage on Unix-like systems, Linux, macOS. Bash is almost always there, so your script will likely just run.
Right.
Python scripts need Python installed, and potentially any third-party libraries you used. Python runs on Windows too, which Bash doesn't natively, but you always have that dependency. The interpreter needs to be present.
So easier deployment for Bash in its home turf.
Generally, yes. And Bash integrates more seamlessly with other standard Unix command line tools.
Security. Always important. How do they compare?
Python usually gets the nod here. It has better built-in error handling, try except blocks, and it's generally less prone to things like shell injection vulnerabilities.
Which can happen in Bash if you're not careful with user input.
Exactly. If you're building command strings by concatenating user input in Bash, you have to be really careful to sanitize it. Python offers safer ways to handle external commands and data.
Okay. And finally, long-term, maintenance and scalability. If scripts get big and complex,
Python really shines here. Its object-oriented features, the way you can structure code into modules and classes, that enforced readability. It all makes larger Python projects much easier to manage, maintain, and scale over time.
whereas complex Bash scripts can become,
A bit of a tangle sometimes, yeah.
yeah,
As they grow, the lack of strong structure, the reliance on stringing commands together, it can make them harder to debug and modify reliably. Python's abstractions usually scale better.
we're getting a really clear comparison.
Yeah.
Now, let's bring in that Evo Technologies perspective. They argued Bash is still quite valuable, right? Why?
Yeah, they made a good case. Their point was, look, Bash is the default on pretty much all Linux systems. It's readily available.
Okay.
It's relatively easy to pick up for basic automation if you're already using the terminal. And it's still very relevant in cloud environments, AWS, Azure, and inside containers for setup scripts and things like that.
So for quick system-level stuff where it's already installed,
It's often the quickest, most efficient solution, no need to install anything extra.
but they also push for Python in other cases. What was their reasoning there?
They highlighted Python's strength for anything more complex, interacting with web APIs, handling large amounts of data. Python's just better equipped.
Right.
They mentioned its structure, the object-oriented approach, those rich libraries for talking to cloud services. That AWS EC2 example they showed in both languages was telling. The Bash version used the AWS CLI tool stringing commands together. The Python version used the Boto3 library, which felt much more like programming, more structured, easier to manage complex logic within the script itself. And they specifically called out Python's better handling of JSON and XML.
Yeah, that structured data point keeps coming up. And what about performance from Evo's view?
They basically echoed what we discussed. For simple, small tasks, performance is probably similar enough not to matter much.
Okay.
But once you start dealing with large files, complex text processing, heavy data manipulation, Python's optimized libraries, and better memory management like garbage collection often give it a significant speed advantage.
And for beginners learning scripting, Ivo had a recommendation.
They lean towards Python, primarily because of the clearer syntax, the built-in data types being a bit richer, and the whole functions module structure providing maybe a gentler intro to programming concepts than Bash's sometimes quirky syntax.
They also mentioned creativity and clean code. What was their final takeaway on choosing?
They framed it as creative problem solving. The goal is an effective solution, but also one that's clean, readable, maintainable. They even said Python can be fun.
Oh, okay.
But ultimately, they said, yeah, it depends. Choose based on the specific needs of your task, your own comfort level, the environment. No single right answer.
Okay, good balanced view. Now let's look at Nico Haikile's piece, the one arguing against using Bash all the time. What was his main beef?
His core argument was about the syntax, really. He finds it, well, ugly was his word, I think. And he feels it has a steep learning curve, especially if you're not already deep in the Unix shell world.
Right.
He used that example of setting a default variable value, how it's kind of awkward in Bash compared to a simple or in Python or JavaScript. His big emphasis was on readability for maintenance. Even quick scripts tend to stick around, he argued.
So even if it works, if it's hard to understand later, that's a problem.
Exactly. He concedes Bash is fine, even good, for small, simple wrapper scripts, automating installs, running tests, basic deployment steps, repeatable manual tasks.
But not for complex logic.
Right. He says it gets cumbersome and hard to manage quickly when the task complexity goes up.
He did offer some tips for better Bash scripting, though, for when you do use it. What were those?
Yeah, practical advice. Use strict mode. Set E, set U, set O pipe fail. These catch common errors, like using unset variables or commands failing unexpectedly within a pipeline.
Okay, make it less forgiving but safer.
Exactly. And install shell check. It's a fantastic linter for Bash scripts. It catches tons of common mistakes and style issues. Highly recommend it.
Good tool.
And he pointed out debugging Bash can be really painful. His advice: if you find yourself spending ages debugging a Bash script, That's a sign. Maybe it's time to rewrite it in something else. Python, JavaScript, Go, whatever is more suitable.
You gave an example from his own work, right? A task that was just too much for Bash.
Yeah, for his Gatsby website build process, he needed interactive prompts, generating SEO slugs, colored terminal output, asynchronous stuff, creating YAML front matter.
Whoa, yeah, that sounds complex.
Right. He said, technically, maybe you could do it in Bash with incredibly complex awk and sed magic, but it would be a nightmare to write, debug, and maintain. Using libraries in JavaScript, in his case, made it vastly simpler.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
And that ties into that blunt comment from Hacker News.
Yeah. Please stop writing shell scripts. Captures that frustration perfectly when people take Bash too far beyond its sweet spot.
Okay, finally, let's look at that Reddit discussion about the ideal language for command line tools. Lots of opinions there. What were the main themes?
A really interesting mix. A big theme was a preference for statically compiled languages. Think Rust and Go.
Why those?
Ease of distribution. You compile it down to a single binary file. No dependencies for the user to install. Just give them the file, they run it. That's a huge win for CLI tools.
Unlike Python, where you need Python installed and maybe libraries.
Exactly. People mention tools like PyInstaller can bundle Python apps, but they can be large, might still have hidden prerequisites or slower startup. C was mentioned for small binaries, but some found its ecosystem, like package management, a bit messy compared to newer languages. Go got a lot of praise for being easy to build static cross-platform binaries. Libraries like Cobra were mentioned for helping build nice CLIs in Go.
So distribution is a really key factor for CLIs.
Absolutely. Who's your audience? How will they get the tool? That heavily influences the language choice. For personal scripts, though, the advice was simpler. Use what you know best.
Makes sense. What about that performance point again? Startup time for CLI tools.
Yeah, that came up again. For tools you run constantly, that little bit of startup lag from interpreted languages like Python or Node.js can actually get annoying.
Compared to a compiled binary or even Bash for simple things.
Right. Bash starts almost instantly for trivial tasks. Compiled Go or Rust binaries also start very quickly. That Reddit thread specifically noted Bash starting faster than Node.js for quick commands.
Were any other interesting languages mentioned for CLIs?
Yeah, a few others popped up. Nim got a shout out. Modern syntax, compiles, static typing, small executables. Perl and TCL were suggested for their traditional strength in text manipulation. Crystal was mentioned as maybe a step up from Bash for more complex scripting, but still aiming for simplicity.
So a lot of options beyond just Bash and Python.
Definitely. The consensus really was, again, it depends. Use case, audience, development time, it all matters.
Okay, let's try and wrap this all up. To bring this deep dive to a close, what are the main takeaways? When Bash, when Python, when maybe something else?
Sure. So Bash, great for quick, simple system automation, gluing command line tools together, especially on Linux, Mac OS, where it's just there. Keep it simple, use strict mode, and shell check.
Got it. Python.
Python. For more complex tasks, anything involving significant data manipulation, web APIs when you need extensive libraries, or when readability and long-term maintenance are really key priorities. Handle structured data like JSON way better.
And the others, like Go or Rust.
Consider those, especially Go or Rust, when you're building CLI tools for distribution. That single binary, no dependencies aspect is really appealing. Performance can also be a big plus.
But at the end of the day,
There's no single best language. It really does depend heavily on the specific job, who you're building it for, what environment it needs to run in, and honestly, what you're comfortable and productive with.
fantastic. That's been a really insightful journey through the scripting landscape. So here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. With things like containers and serverless becoming so common, how do you see the roles of traditional scripting languages like Bash and Python evolving? Are new tools or maybe different approaches going to become more dominant for automation? Something to think about for your next project. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.